They were beautiful, obedient, and silent, but behind the palace walls. Male concubines in the Ottoman Empire lived through horrors the world conveniently forgot. Castrated as young boys, stripped of their identity, and forced into lives of quiet submission, these enslaved males were not just property, they were prisoners of elegance. While Western history glamorizes the Ottoman court's luxury and seduction, it buries the brutal reality. Male concubines were mutilated, trafficked, and silenced by fear. Their lives were governed by whims, their bodies controlled by imperial desire. To survive, they had to adapt learning court etiquette, mastering music and dance, even spying on rivals. They were close to power, but never free. In this video, we're pulling back the silk curtains and showing you the unspeakable truths. These are the horrific things that were considered completely normal for Ottoman male concubines. Long before they stepped foot into the opulent palaces of the Ottoman Empire, the fate of male concubines was already sealed in blood. Their journey didn't begin with silks and incense, it began with shackles, blades, and silence. The young boys who would become concubines were often taken from Africa, Eastern Europe, or the Caucasus. They were captured through war, raids, or sold by desperate families. Most were between the ages of 8 and 12. Why that young? Because the empire needed them trainable, moldable, and most importantly prepubescent. The first horrific thing that awaited them, castration, not metaphorical, not symbolic, real. These boys were forcibly mutilated, castrated to prevent them from ever becoming full men. The procedure was brutal, often performed with no anesthesia, and survival was far from guaranteed. In many cases, both the penis and testicles were removed, in others, only the testicles. It depended on the role they were being prepared for. Regardless, the risks were staggering: infections, internal bleeding, even death. And here's the horrifying twist: castrated boys were worth more on the slave market. A full male slave might cost a few coins, but a eunuch, especially one who survived the procedure, could fetch prices equal to a skilled craftsman or a fine horse. The survivors were prized not just for their obedience but because they could safely live among women in the harem without risk. They weren't seen as men. They weren't seen as women. They were a third category, eunuchs, half human in the eyes of the empire, but fully enslaved. Once purchased or acquired, the boys were transported to the imperial palace. And that's where the second layer of horror began. Read-education.uc. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just concerned with controlling their bodies, it wanted their minds too. The concubines were immediately stripped of their past, their names, religions, languages, and even memories. They were given Turkish or Arabic names. Christian boys were forcibly converted to Islam. Their old identities were erased like chalk on a board. Then came indoctrination. They were taught to walk a certain way, smooth, soft, never too masculine. They were trained in poetry, music, court, etiquette, and dance. The idea was to make them desirable, but never dominant. Their entire existence became about pleasure and service, but not their own. They lived to serve the elite, especially the Sultan and his inner circle. And that service, it came with rules, terrifying ones. Concubines could never look a royal in the eye unless invited. They could never speak unless spoken to. Any slip could mean punishment. And punishment in the harem was not a slap on the wrist. Beatings, starvation, solitary confinement, even execution by suffocation, it was all legal. Because remember, these boys were not considered people, they were property. Now, here's something even more disturbing. Many of the concubines weren't used for sex, at least not directly. Their main job was to maintain the order of the harem and serve the women, yes, the women of the palace. Eunuchs were often placed in charge of guarding royal women because they were seen as safe. The sultan's wives, concubines, and daughters were never allowed to interact freely with other men. Only eunuchs could be near them. But what sounds like a position of trust was, in fact, another layer of torment. These eunuchs became surveillance tools. They weren't just guards. They were spies. They were expected to report every word, every whisper, every glance. If one of the harem women spoke ill of the sultan, the eunuch was expected to report her, and that could mean her death. Now imagine this: a child, castrated, torn from home, taught to serve and spy, being forced to betray the very people they lived with every day. That level of psychological damage, unimaginable. But it gets darker. Some concubines did become sexual servants, especially those considered beautiful by court standards. Long eyelashes, light skin, or soft features often determined their fate. These boys could be passed around by high-ranking officials, and since there were no legal rights for them, they had no say. Consent was irrelevant. And even when they became adults, if they survived that long, they were never free. They couldn't marry, couldn't have children, couldn't own property unless specifically granted by a superior. They lived and died within the palace walls, and even if they reached high status within the eunuch hierarchy, like the infamous chief black eunuch, who had power second only to the sultan, they were still prisoners in silk robes. Let's talk about that hierarchy. Yes, even among concubines and eunuchs, there was a strict system. At the bottom were the newcomers, young, recently castrated, barely trained. These were the most vulnerable. They handled the dirtiest work, cleaning, cooking, running errands, and enduring the cruel test of obedience. As they aged or survived, they could rise to become personal servants to the sultan's family. If exceptionally loyal or intelligent, a select few could climb further to become supervisors, treasurers, or secretaries. And at the very top, the chief eunuch. He held immense political influence, controlling who got access to the sultan, managing court communication, even influencing royal succession. In some cases, he was more feared than generals. But don't let the title fool you. Even at the top, you were still expendable. A single whisper against your name, a jealous rival, or a change in leadership and you'd vanish overnight. Poisoned, banished, forgotten. And your body tossed in a ditch outside the palace walls, because eunuchs weren't given proper burials. They weren't buried with the free. They were buried in special cemeteries, often without names. Their existence wasn't honored, it was erased. By the end of the 17th century, there were thousands of eunuchs in service across the empire. Their numbers grew, but their suffering stayed hidden behind luxurious drapes and golden walls. While tourists today marvel at the beauty of Topkapi Palace, few ever ask, who built this? Who suffered here? The legacy of male concubines is not one of luxury, it's one of trauma. And yet, history barely whispers their names. Once inside the Topkapi Palace, the lives of male concubines shifted from physical torment to psychological warfare. Their bodies had already been sacrificed, but now their minds and identities were reshaped to serve the empire. Everything from how they walked to how they looked at people was controlled. They were no longer allowed to be boys or men. They were expected to become silent shadows, moving behind the scenes of power. At first glance, their surroundings were stunning: grand halls, gold-plated doors, silk carpets, and endless gardens. But none of it belonged to them. They were dressed in fine fabrics and fed rich food, but they remained property. They didn't own their names anymore. Many were renamed by their masters, often stripped of their original language and culture. The palace became their prison, no matter how beautiful it looked. Those who proved loyal and capable were trained to become harem guards, or servants to the sultan himself. A select few rose even higher, becoming eunuchs trusted with the most sensitive duties. One of the most powerful roles a former male concubine could reach was that of the chief black eunuch. Ironically, this position made them one of the most influential people in the empire. They controlled access to the harem, advised the sultan on palace matters, and handled royal communications. But even this power was conditional. The sultan could remove or execute them at any moment. Inside the harem, they were surrounded by hundreds of concubines and royal women. Most men weren't even allowed to step foot in that space. But eunuchs were used as neutral bodies, neither man nor woman trusted to serve without desire. But the truth was more complicated. These eunuchs weren't emotionless. Many formed quiet bonds with the women they guarded. Some fell in love. Others harbored secret resentments. But nothing could be acted on. Any hint of attachment could mean exile, torture, or death. The surveillance was constant. Even high-ranking eunuchs had spies watching them. Loyalty had to be proven daily. If a eunuch was suspected of gossiping, conspiring, or showing too much emotion, they could be banished without trial. Trust did not exist in the palace. It was every man, every eunuch for himself. Race also played a major role in how they were treated. Many black eunuchs came from East Africa and were subjected to full castration, meaning both their penis and testicles were removed. This made their condition far more dangerous and painful. White eunuchs, often from the Balkans or Caucasus, were sometimes only partially castrated. As a result, black eunuchs were mostly assigned to serve in the harem, while white eunuchs worked in administrative parts of the palace. Despite doing some of the empire's most crucial and intimate work, black eunuchs were treated as lower than their white counterparts. Outside of the palace, common people viewed eunuchs with suspicion. Many feared them, others mocked them. Some saw them as traitors who helped the empire enslave and exploit others, even in death. They were rarely honored. Few had graves. Most disappeared from history, remembered only as tools of the empire. The power some eunuchs held was both a blessing and a curse. While they could influence politics, lead massive religious projects, and even decide who the sultan would marry, they were still slaves. Their rise in the hierarchy didn't change the fact that they had no control over their bodies or futures. They were used by the empire until they were no longer useful. When a sultan died, everything changed. A new ruler meant new alliances, new suspicions, and often mass removals. Eunuchs who were favored by the old sultan were quickly dismissed, sometimes executed. Their fates were tied entirely to the whims of the court. A lifetime of loyalty could be erased in seconds. Some eunuchs attempted to escape or flee the empire, but that too often ended in execution. They knew too many secrets, they had seen too much. The empire couldn't afford for them to speak freely. Silence was demanded, not just in life, but in death. In rare cases, a eunuch could retire peacefully. A handful were allowed to settle in Cairo or Mecca and live out their remaining years, running religious charities or managing properties, but even then, they were watched carefully. The empire never truly let them go, despite their suffering. The contributions of male concubines and eunuchs to the Ottoman Empire were enormous. They shaped royal decisions, managed massive bureaucracies, and protected some of the most powerful women in history. But behind their roles, behind the silk garments and gold buttons, were broken boys forced into servitude. Their pain was hidden. Behind palace walls, their voices were never heard. Their stories were rarely recorded. Historians often ignored them, reducing them to side characters in the lives of kings and queens. Yet, they were the ones who held the empire's secrets, who managed the daily affairs of the court, who ensured the system worked smoothly. They were survivors of a brutal system, victims of ambition, conquest, and cruelty. Their existence was a reminder of how power can dehumanize, and how, even in the most beautiful places, the most horrific truths can be hidden in plain sight. There was no escape from life once a boy became a male concubine in the Ottoman Empire. Even those who rose to high ranks lived in a constant state of tension. Every day was about survival, maintaining favor, avoiding suspicion, and controlling every word, every expression. One slip could lead to immediate punishment. Sometimes the punishment wasn't physical. It was silent, isolation, removal from their role, and relocation to a forgotten wing of the palace, never to be heard from again. While the sultan enjoyed absolute power, he too was surrounded by paranoia, and male concubines, especially the powerful eunuchs, were both tools and threats. Many knew the secrets of royal affairs, political schemes, even private indiscretions of the harem and royal family. The more they knew, the more dangerous they became. And in a palace where betrayal was always expected, knowing too much could be a death sentence. Rumors often circulated about eunuchs who disappeared overnight. No trial, no explanation. One day they were managing harem affairs, and the next, their rooms were emptied, their names never spoken again. Some said they were executed. Others believed they were sent to distant provinces to live in anonymity, forbidden from ever returning to Istanbul. Either way, they were erased from history by design. The psychological toll of this life was unimaginable. These men were not allowed to love, to marry, or to have children. Their futures were not their own. Even if they served for decades, loyalty was rewarded only with continued service. No matter how powerful they became, they could never outrank their past. They were slaves always. Their mutilation had not only changed their bodies, it had removed their right to legacy. Some found purpose in religion. They dedicated themselves to Islamic scholarship, serving in religious roles connected to the palace. A few became endowment managers, overseeing mosques or charities on behalf of the sultan or his family. But even in those positions, they were always seen as different, not fully men, not fully free, not fully trusted. In the rare event they were granted retirement, they were sometimes allowed to settle in cities like Cairo or Mecca. There, they could live out the rest of their days in quiet anonymity, far from the eyes of the empire. But they were still watched. Letters were intercepted, associates monitored. The empire never forgot its former servants. It only let them go when it was sure they could do no harm. These retired eunuchs rarely spoke of their time in the palace, not because they didn't want to, but because the trauma ran so deep it had become unspeakable. Some had spent decades without family, without affection, without privacy. The psychological damage was so profound that many lived their final years in near solitude. What makes their story even more tragic is how easily they've been forgotten. While the stories of sultans, warriors, and queens have been written in grand detail, the lives of these men who were instrumental in the day-to-day functioning of the empire remain buried under layers of silence and shame. They were witnesses to history, but were never allowed to tell it. Their existence was both crucial and invisible. They cleaned the palace floors before royal visitors arrived. They managed the schedules of royal women. They passed messages between the sultan and his mother. They maintained the delicate balance of a complex imperial machine. Yet they had no statues, No poems, no family names passed down through generations. Their only legacy is the haunting silence left behind. In many ways, their suffering represents a deeper truth about empires, that power is often built on the backs of the voiceless, that the most glittering palaces are maintained by those who live in the shadows, and that sometimes the most loyal servants are the most broken of all. Today, when tourists visit Istanbul's palaces, they marvel at the architecture, the jewels, the ceremonial robes, but few ask who kept those halls spotless, who guarded the gates, who gave up everything including their bodies to keep the system intact. The Ottoman male concubines did not choose this life. They were stolen, bought, reshaped, and used. Their horror was normalized by a system that required silence and obedience above all else. They were seen as expendable, and yet, without them, the empire's most private and powerful institutions would not have functioned. They were the watchers behind the curtains, the hands behind the curtain cords. They had no control over their beginnings, and most had no say in their endings. But in the quiet corridors of history, their presence is still there, haunting, invisible, but undeniable. Their story deserves to be told, not as an exotic curiosity or a historical footnote, but as a testament to the cruelty that flourished behind the beauty of empire. Their silence was enforced, but we can break it now by remembering, by questioning, and by refusing to let their pain be erased. We often celebrate the beauty of empires, but we rarely talk about the pain hidden behind the palace walls. The story you just heard isn't fiction. It's a harsh reality lived by countless boys whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged. If this truth moved you, if it made you question what we've been taught about history, don't let it end here. Share this video so others can learn what was done behind closed doors. Leave a comment. Tell us how this made you feel. Was this something you knew, or was it buried? Like so many of these lives. And if you want to uncover more dark, hidden truths of the past, subscribe and join us on this journey of truth-telling, because remembering them is the first step toward honoring them. These weren't just concubines, they were human beings, robbed of freedom, identity, and voice. Let's be the voice they never had.